Hello and welcome, everyone. I must say, we have the best backstage music. So, we've got trust building strategies, how HR can build lasting relationships founded on trust. And I'd like to welcome our esteemed panel. But before I do that, I will just introduce myself. I am Renika Weston, an executive coach and facilitator with P Link Leadership. I see everyone joining. So I hope I wasn't too early in saying what I said. You all were able to hear that. But wasn't that a nice jam backstage in the green room? Wow. All right. So we've got Allison, we've got Kelly, we've got Paco, correct? Angela and Takara. So if I mispronounced anyone's name, I know you all shared it with me before. Please let me know. All right. Let's go ahead and get started. The first question I have is, believe it or not, about trust. So, how do you define trust in the context of HR work? And I'll preface that by saying I actually posted this on LinkedIn today. And one of the posts, you can actually go to the post, I'm not making this up. And someone said, historically, many folks in organizations don't necessarily trust HR. And so if we are the champions, the leaders moving this whole thing forward, how do you define trust in the context of HR work? Who'd like to begin? Who'd like to kick us off? Maybe Kelly. I see a big smile.
Sure. Hi, everyone. I'm really happy to be here, and with all the other panelists, of course. Thank you. So for me, I've been doing HR for about 24 years, mostly in Bay Area, California-based enterprise SaaS companies. And for me, I will add in, first of all, I think we assume that everyone knows what we do, especially the employee base, right? And the reality is they think we're Toby from The Office, and they don't know what we do, and they think that we hire and fire people and that we're the police. And I think I just break that first, right? So I usually meet with literally every single employee and do two things. Use humor to ask them what they think of HR, and actually use that analogy. And they just basically laugh and admit that they do think that's what we do. And then second is who I am as a person. What I care about as an individual and an employee, but also my philosophy on this work and what we actually do. And it just kind of opens up their horizons and changes the whole vibe and the playing field of the conversation. So what I would say is don't be afraid to lean in first and demystify yourself in this function, because the perception is real. I'm generalizing, but that's usually what I've seen and heard. So that's a
Yeah.
spicy kickoff. I'll take it.
Thank you so much, Kelly. So, for those of you who might work in larger organizations where you don't necessarily get to know everyone, right? If you're an HR business partner, maybe you get that opportunity. But what happens? And I know Allison, you might be in a fairly large size organization. Can you share with us maybe how you define trust?
Thanks. I have been. I'm ex-Amazon and ex-U.S. military, an Army officer, so kind of doesn't get much bigger than that. But I really, Kelly, appreciate you starting with trust with the employee, right? I think that's where our minds often go, and it's a critical piece. When I think about this question, I think about trust in terms of what we might traditionally think of as our clients, right? Our clients in the business. Because if you've been in a position where you're trying to do good HR work and those business clients don't trust you, you know it can be a nightmare, right? And there's a tremendous cost to working in that kind of environment. That's easily quantifiable in terms of suboptimal employee experience, reduced engagement, attrition, productivity, and all of those things, right? And so when I think about this from a larger organizational perspective, I think about how we measure trust, because it is measurable. You can see it in well-designed employee engagement surveys. But we all know you don't have to, you sometimes don't have to have that kind of data to know that trust is low in an organization. Right. Today, I am in an organization that's a little bit smaller. I work for a company called Cruise that is building autonomous cars, and it's there are about 2,500 cruisers in the U.S. and around the world, and you ask questions, you get to know people. You can hear it. You hear it in the way that they talk about what you do. You can see it in body language when you sit down to a virtual meeting, right? I think we have an implicit understanding as human beings when someone trusts us and when they don't. It's wired into us.
Love that, Allison. And one of the things that you mentioned is with the organization that you're with, you're talking about some new technology. So there also has to be trust amongst the internal team, but also as you build that trust with the internal team, that flows outward into the community as well.
I love that. And
yeah.
Your customers will never trust you more than your employees do.
Love that. All right. I hope someone wrote that down because you just dropped a nugget. So I am going to ask a question of Takara. Am I pronouncing that correct? The name like Renika, I want to make sure I pronounce individuals' names
no, you
correct.
nailed it. You nailed it.
So, one of the things that we heard was really, you just know it when you can feel it. And I often tell people spidey sense is for marvel, but discernment comes with wisdom, experience, and all those other things. So you're right. There are sometimes you can just feel it. There are a multitude of models that are out there for trust. And I teach those trust models to individuals. But, tell me how you just know it. What are some of the things that you do in order to build trust, and how you know it? Maybe they're questions you ask or just a feeling you get.
Yeah, so that's a really good question. So for me, I think someone said it before already. I try to always lead with my personality first. That is how I build trust, because I want every other employee in the organization to see we may have different roles, but we're all very similar. And this is the role that I play in the organization. But for me and my organization, we use employee engagement to really gauge how our colleagues feel about the people and culture department or about HR, what have you. That is how we typically gauge the temperature of the organization, is by those. And so with that, you see in employee engagement, how large or how often are we having conflicts that cannot be resolved? Are people coming to us with confidential matters? So just a couple examples, just off the top.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you. So Paco, I'm going to follow up on that because, if in fact, and one of the things, I believe it was Kelly said something about law enforcement, right? So if I, as a young person, decide that I want to go in law enforcement, I may have a feeling of trust of law enforcement. I may have a feeling of distrust, right? It just kind of depends. It's all over the place. But oftentimes we don't go into HR as a young graduate feeling that people are going to distrust us, right? We go in for so many different reasons. So I'm just curious. This is sort of a twofold question. What led you to HR, Paco? And then when did you realize that people don't necessarily trust HR and we've got to do something about this?
I love that. You can hear me okay? Yes?
Yes.
Okay, perfect. I had some mic issues. That's why I wanted to take. So it's so funny. I mean, everything's so connected, and I really like how you led with that question. I studied business, and I had a natural tendency, to work with people and blah, blah, blah. So I wanted to go to sales or marketing. And one large company went out there to campus and was just recruiting. The recruiter told me, "We like you for a summer internship. Why don't you come in for an internship in HR?" And I was like, "What? HR?" I had the worst training in college. It was a payroll class. It was accounting. It was horrible. I was like, "I'm not going to do that. HR is boring." Well, they convinced me, and I stayed for 16 years in that same organization in HR. So, I know a lot of us just stumble upon it in some shape or form. And I still think I will go and ask that recruiter how she's doing and what did she see in me, right? That's something that always stuck in my mind. When I found out very early on the dichotomy, or the interesting pendulum swing between H and R, and that means how much do people, including people in our profession and employees and managers, look at us between, are you only looking at the resource side, or are you only looking at the human side? And how do you manage that complex pendulum? It was very, very early on my career where I started seeing that leaders were asking me to do things. Hopefully you can still hear me.
Oh yeah. Okay. No
Okay.
issues.
Okay, that leaders are asking you to do things on behalf of the company, but sometimes or several times those things will not necessarily be in the best interest of the average employee, and you're then the bad cop, right? And that's what they hire you to do. And I from those very early times, I was very it was not a good feeling to be in the middle of that. I really wanted to be somewhere more in the middle. So it has been a journey through time, and how I've managed to just be okay sometimes with being the bad cop if I actually understand it's the right thing to do. So that's kind of an Amazon thing. Allison and I work also at Amazon, is disagree and commit, right? Sometimes you actually do have to disagree and commit with certain things if it's for the greater good of the business. That, by the way, it can also be the greater good of the people, which means, for example, less layoffs or stuff like that. So long story short, going back to what some of the, or long story long, I guess, to what the team was saying, I think one of the key things I've observed in trust building is, are you doing the best that you can with what you have, and are you being genuine with it? And I we can double click on that as we go, but people actually read you and they can smell if you're being genuine or if you're just playing the company line, and if you're being cynical about it.
Yeah, I love that. You said at Amazon they would say it's not that you what was the term? Because I have another term. What was it?
Disagree and commit. Mm-hmm.
Disagree and commit. So one of my other favorite terms, if you're not a Gen Xer, you might not remember this, but we had a previous president that would say trust and verify, right? And so with HR, oftentimes we are systems people, we are systems thinkers. And within a system, you have to trust it, right? When you think about our economy, you think about any system you're in, because it's not just one thing or one person. So when you think of HR, you think about the system of HR. And the fact that people do need to trust, how do you get people to verify that they really trust you? And that's open to anyone.
I'll jump in. I always say that two of our most important products are credibility and judgment. And a lot of times the verification comes through the whispers of your leadership and how people perceive you. So, and that can turn very quickly, right? I think the other panelists mentioned, you have one experience or whatnot, that person's going to tell 10 people in the organization, and then they'll tell 10 others. And maybe by the end, the story is completely off, but it doesn't matter. And so you want those stories, because they will happen, whether they're good or neutral or bad, they're going to happen. So how can you make sure that that consistency, that credibility, and that judgment is always there, so that story is good? And I don't mean to be everyone's friend and make everyone happy, but to be authentic and consistent matters more than giving everyone hugs, right? So I think that is the most important part, because that narrative can be, you might not always get the answer you want, but they're transparent, they're direct, they're authentic, and they care, and they're consistent, which is the biggest thing. So I think the verification will come one way or the other, and you might know about it and you might not. And if you don't, that's usually not a great sign.
Yeah, love that. Thank you. Anyone else want to add anything to that? Thank you, Kelly. All right. So the next question that I have, and I love stories and analogies, right? And so I was talking to my son on the drive to school today, and I said, I have to do what's in the best interest of the house, because there's a 16-year-old, what's in the best interest is what's in the best interest of him. It's all about him. And so if I use that analogy and I think about the organizations in which we serve, oftentimes HR has to take the company's side, right? And so how do you navigate that? I just told you how I navigated with my son, right? I talked to him about doing what's the best interest of our house, but talk to me about that and how that maybe a situation where that's actually built trust, where someone maybe came in with distrust, but after having that type of conversation and navigating that, it actually was able to build trust. Anyone?
I can go. One of my favorite, well, a mentor of mine several years ago told me that when you really saw the true value of an HR professional or any professional is the way that they communicate bad news and how do they communicate them. Are they trustworthy? Are they genuine? Are they real on what they're saying, or are they just following company lines? And I know I've been repetitive about this, but I think it connects very well with what you're saying. For example, what he told us was, even when you're laying someone off for something terrible, if you spend enough time to be real with the person, to show what happened, and to be transparent about it, well, as much as you can, because there's always guardrails, but to be transparent and to avoid all of these other robotic things that we can fall into a trap of going to if we're too functionalistic. I just made up that word, but hopefully it makes sense.
Like it.
People, funny or weirdly enough, they give you the hand and say thank you. Even if you're telling them terrible news, because you're actually being real with them. You're being another human talking to another human. Because one of the biggest traps that we can follow, I fell in that trap many times, and I have to still catch myself on it, is when we dehumanize people, because there's volumes of issues that we encounter. And sometimes when you just have to take the company side, if you're doing it, not cynically though, because one of the other pitfalls that we fall into, I've done it too, and I've learned, is when you become cynical and then you take the people side and you become kind of like the union steward, and you say, yeah, those people, they don't know what they're doing. I'm sorry, I just have to tell you. That really backfires as well. So you just have to be realistic, tell things as they are, not sugarcoat, but with enough care that they know that you're doing your job, but you are caring about them.
Yeah, I love that. I love that. Allison.
Renika, could I? Yeah, thank you.
Yeah.
Paco, I'm so glad that you brought up layoffs. If you've done HR work in tech recently, you probably have some experience with this, good, bad, or indifferent. And if you've been doing this work in tech for a while, I mean, some of us have been around this merry-go-round a few times, right? And have seen it done really well and seen it done really poorly. I think for me that the answer to your question, Renika, starts with recognizing that it is not a zero-sum game, right? Doing what's best for the company, doing what's best for people it's not a zero-sum game. We can do both, right? And we can do both really, really well. We've just been through a challenging time in this regard at Cruise, where we've had went through a round of layoffs at the end of last year. Going into that, right, we upfront rejected the zero-sum game, right? We're going to do this in a way that is, we're going to do the very best that we can do, not just by the company, but by those who we're having to say goodbye. And that, we saw them as human beings. We recognized their real human needs, their fears, their anxieties, their anger in the middle of all of this. We resolved to do the best that we could when it came to their package as we were offering as we let them go. We did the very best we could providing information. We set up an entire, a series of supports that we could offer on the other side of that reduction in force to help them ease their way into their next role. And the result of that, right, it was hard. Those moments are hard, and there's nothing that we can do that's going to make them not hard, right? But we see when we saw employees posting about that on LinkedIn saying, this sucks and I've been through it, and this was probably the most humanely managed RIF that I've seen. When the employees who are left can say, I feel that little bit of survivor's guilt. I feel a lot of survivor's guilt, but I feel better knowing that we took care of our colleagues, right? You can do these things in a way that actually builds trust and leaves you better off in terms of trust on the other side, even though they're hard, if you can reject the zero-sum game up front.
Yeah, I love that. I think one of the challenges that employees often have is whether you want to admit it or not, or say that your workplace is family, it is such a big part of who you are. And in a layoff, there's a piece of your identity that's no longer there, right? And so then you've got to grapple with that. There's a sense of community that's lost. For any of us that have left organizations, it's like, can I reach back to people? Can I not reach back to people? It's sort of all of those things. And I had someone say to me one time in HR is that they actually asked the person, talking about layoffs, they said, what does support look like? And the person didn't really know what support looked like. And they said, if there's something from a support standpoint that I can do to support you, let me know. And that simple thing, whether the person comes back or not or says anything, means the world sometimes to individuals. But I'm curious because someone put in the chat, may sound simple, but it's not that simple, right? And the slightest thing we say, because people are hanging on our every word during those times. But any insight or advice that you may have given to someone where trust was broken, and it could be a leader that you supported, and it makes it even more exciting if it was a senior leader that you had to have this conversation with. So has anyone had any situations like that? I see you smiling, Allison. Doesn't have to be a big conversation. It could be you basically coaching a leader on trust building for their teams.
Yeah, I can jump in here and answer. So for me, whenever I'm coaching any leader, any C-suite, it always is reinforcing open communication, right? And being open to hearing, listening, providing empathy and sympathy where necessary, but listening. Very early on in my career, that's what I noticed a lot of leaders lack. Is just assigning the work, but not really rolling up the sleeve to jump in and do it. And for me, a successful leader is one that is saying, listen, I know this wasn't ideal, but keeping that communication open. How do we get through it? Here are the support. Here's support that I can offer. And actually listening to colleagues or employees is what I always advise senior leaders is listen, because you learn a lot of jewels from that.
Yeah, thank you. Anything else, Kelly, Allison, or Paco? Anything to add to that? No.
Yeah, I think with senior leaders, again, it's kind of the same playbook. Like, how do they break the perceptions that are about them, right? And any senior leader in the organization has those, and they usually aren't aware of maybe they're considered unapproachable or this or that because of their position. So there's many strategies, but my thing is, how do you break that? Because if you can break that, and again, if their feedback is good or not good about you, that's still trust. So how can you get close to that organization, like Takara was mentioning? How can you get close to those team members and unveil for them as much as you can how you work, how you tick, how you think, why you're doing the things you're doing, not just doing them and then not saying why. I mean, there's things like that, and it takes energy, communication, extra cycles, but a lot of leaders don't know how to build that in. They're like, well, how do I do that? And comes natural to some and not to others.
Yeah, thank you. As a coach, I love hearing that, because I always say to people, I have a sales background. I tell people you're always selling and you're always coaching. And so it's exciting and sort of makes my heart flutter to know that there's a great deal of coaching that's over there with leaders as well. So when you think about the title of this, it said building strategies. And so you all have mentioned a number of strategies. I took a couple of notes here. Curiosity was one of those. The strategy of how do I remain transparent, but also understanding that everything can't necessarily be shared with individuals. Helping people to understand who I am. That's a strategy that you mentioned. But I want to go back to uh, the confidentiality, because I think we were talking about different questions and things that people may be interested in. And let's go back to that balancing transparency with confidentiality and privacy. So there's an element of privacy. Like people want to know, well, why did so and so get whatever they got? And it's kind of like HIPAA. That's what I say. You don't ask those questions about people's health, right? So let's just understand privacy as it relates to that. But how do you balance that confidentiality, being transparent with people so that they know enough and also foster trust? Anyone?
Can I go?
Yeah, of course.
Let me tell you a super quick experiment that CHRO of one of the companies that I work for did, which was very interesting, a little bit controversial, but interesting. So what he did is he planted a rumor among all of the C-suite of the company of something that was fake and told them all that it was highly confidential and sensitive, and they could not share it with anybody. That came back to him through another channel, through a group outside of that in less than 24 hours. So one of the things that happens with all of us humans, all of us, we love to gossip. We urge to gossip. It's just part of who we are. And it's so difficult for the average human. Now, if some of you have been masters of that, my full respect to you all, and I'm on that journey, but it's so difficult sometimes to, when you know a lot of things, you want to, blow some steam and tell somebody. Now, of course, as an HR professional, there's ways to do that. Either your therapist, your priest, your whomever that is, right? In high confidentiality or whomever that is. But in summary, jokes aside, I think it can get quite complicated. Number one, to maintain all of that. But number two, to see how do you feed some of that information that can be appropriate. So, for example, one of the tools that I use is I can literally say to the person, look, I know you're very curious about what's happening. I literally cannot tell you what's happening. I know what's happening. I cannot tell you. Hopefully you understand why. And I sometimes bring back some of the context because it's interesting and funny, but not that funny that sometimes people just don't even understand why you cannot tell them. Seriously, it's interesting, but sometimes you can come back and say, there are certain things happening I just cannot tell you at the moment. I'm being transparent with you by telling you that I cannot tell you, So yeah, sometimes it's just what it is. And sometimes though, I think we have to be balanced in exaggeration of not saying anything, or lack of transparency. I have fought sometimes some battles where there was an unnecessarily push for lack of transparency because legal or someone else just came in and they really wanted to be overly conservative. Sometimes I won that battle. Sometimes I lost that battle. And I go back to disagree and commit. Sometimes it's really, in my opinion, just being too conservative and there's really not a real cause of what you're doing. So I think it's a little bit of a case by case, but some of the tools I've used I just mentioned. So hopefully it's useful.
Yeah, I love that. When you were talking, Paco, one of the things I wrote down was what's at risk? So if there's something that cannot be shared, maybe the question is what's at risk? And it could be the one thing that's at risk is a huge thing, so we best not share. It could be multiple small things, but because there's so many of the small things, we would just rather not share it at all. And then the other two questions I wrote down is, what's the best thing about? So what's the best thing about us sharing this with individuals? And maybe what's the best thing about that? What's the best thing about that? And then what's the worst thing about us sharing this with individuals? And having some sort of a framework that's as simple as a few questions to ask the leaders within organizations to understand that. Anyone else? Just in that moment, I thought about that. But anyone else have something they use?
Ranika, I'd love to speak to this. Look, I've got my start in HR work in diversity, equity, and inclusion, and it's still a core part of the work that I do in this space. And we have to think about transparency in a very nuanced way, right? When we think about being transparent with, I'm thinking here about employee data, right? What I'm hearing from you is a key question that I've learned to ask in order to get this right, which is why? Why are we being transparent? Why would we want to be transparent? What is the business case for greater transparency with, say, DEI-related employee data? For us at Cruise, we spend a lot of time working on that, and it'll sound like a rote sort of memorized statement, because it is. We believe that since DEI is a part of every employee's job description, that every employee has a business need to know how we're doing on this front, what we're doing about it, and why we're doing those things, and what they're intended to accomplish. So there is a clear business case. Then with that business case, then we can have conversations with our partners and stakeholders, like those in the legal department. We can have a conversation about the real risk of being transparent with data versus a perceived risk. We can research. I can't tell you how many times I've made an introduction to a legal partner in the company I'm working for, to another former legal partner I've worked with who's navigated all of the questions about transparency and say, look, you don't need to hear it from me. Here's another lawyer who can talk to you about what the real risk is. And then, then we can do the smart things, like working with our analytics teams, making sure we know the risks related to really small populations, that de-identified data becomes re-identified because the population is so small. There's a real trust risk there as well, right? To individual employee data inadvertently coming out. So we can navigate that effectively. We've got to navigate all of those things effectively in order to thread the needle here of trust and transparency. But the outcomes are worth it. I've found over and over again that being more transparent in this area, at least, even when the data isn't great, right, builds trust. It helps build momentum for improvement incrementally as you go forward.
You just gave us a whole new topic for a panel discussion. Because in so many organizations, when you talk about diversity, equity, and inclusion, and I say to people, it's not a word, it's an acronym, that each of those words actually mean something. And so for some organizations, they are comfortable putting up the numbers when the numbers look good. And when the numbers don't look good, we don't want to show any numbers. And then some organizations don't want to show the numbers because they feel like some people aren't included, and they really focus on inclusion. And if I show these numbers, they may be numbers that show how diverse we are, but then other people feel excluded. So to your point is, what is the purpose? The other thing that I love that you said is community. Like, you really have to establish, and if you've come up in an organization and been there for all of your career, that's okay, no judgment, but you have to go outside of that organization to start to build a community. So I am lobbying for another panel, and I hope that if Enrique says yes, that you all would join for that, because that's a whole nother topic in and of itself around trust, especially around the data as it relates to DEI. But I'll pause. Kelly or Takar, do you have anything else to add?
I would just double click that. That was amazing. I don't even want to mess up that perfectly good explanation, because that was amazing. And showing that data holds us all accountable. So I love it. That was fantastic. I need you to say it again so I can record it.
Yeah. Yeah, is this being recorded? Yeah, I think just to keep it simple for everyone, like at least for me, this is how I think about it, is the trust is like, do they believe you or not? No matter what you're saying, do they believe you? And you know, the BS meter now is very strong. And you know, once you know, it's very clear, oh, you're showing data because it's good, you're not showing data because it's bad. They're not going to believe you anymore. And so for me, you know, I always think of like, what about what we're presenting would cause the organization not to believe us? And it's not that you have to say everything, but you always have to explain why or why not. That is the main thing. And again, is it consistent? Is it authentic? Um, and does the organization believe you? Because that is the biggest thing that we see with employees leaving any organization. They don't believe what they're being fed, and they'll go somewhere else and they will vote with their feet. And I don't know about you all, but trust, I mean, think about your friendships, your family, like the most trust is built when you're vulnerable and you're admitting something that might not be easy to admit. And that is a leadership competency now that I think is table stakes. And some of the best cultures is that vulnerability.
Yeah.
If I can add just a quick anecdote,
Yes, definitely.
probably you've seen that my style is always anecdotal, but my favorite move that any leader has ever done to build trust automatically, and it was almost magical, was this external leader came into this very established company where you normally did not hire external people. You always groom them from within. And the very first move he did was send a letter to the 3,000 people roughly on his organization. I was his HR partner. And he said at his second, paragraph, he said, I am terrified. I am very scared because this is such an established institution and there's so much expectation for me to be successful. But I will do my best and I will take care of you as I take care of my family. Those were the words that he said on a very polished organization that normally you follow all of these talking points and all this stuff. I can tell you, I've never seen how fast the trust on a leader came with just a few words. And then, of course, it can fall if he's just full of, of not doing what he's saying. But he was very coherent. And every week, he had either a note that he sent to employees or whatever with the latest, and it was just his style. So, vulnerability, I fully agree, Kelly. And we just have to be vulnerable. Very difficult to do, particularly on the HR function sometimes, because we always have to portray that we're at best. But sometimes it's good for people to know that we're also, not having a good day, So.
Yeah. Thank you. One of the things that I heard you say is communication. And in some really large organizations, communication oftentimes will fall under HR. Some organizations don't even have communication. But it sounds like a really clear communication strategy is also one of the tools that we need to build trust. And if you're not thinking about the cadence and the content of what you are communicating, then you aren't thinking about one of the most important tools to build trust in an organization. So I see some head shake. So yes. So tell me more, because that's Renika's philosophy, but you all are right there in it. So tell me a little bit more about that. No more to say? Well, I'm curious. Do you all have a communication strategy with trust sort of as the foundation of it, or is it wrapped around trust, or?
Yeah. I mean, this is what I was kind of alluding to earlier when we were talking about leaders and their organizations, and for us, I mean, just an example, we had a people team at Pendo here that was probably almost 70 people at one point. And it's not structured to be, for structure's sake, but the timing of things was important. And so we were like, how do we take these 70 people along with us and be as transparent as possible and not spend all day long talking to people? So it was a mix of like, let's have a town hall meeting literally every month, and let's time that town hall after an exec team meeting or after a board meeting so that we can actually give the team the relevant information, the metrics, the priorities, the knowledge, and not just have it be, you know, a meeting. So that's what I mean when you think strategically. It's like, what do you want to be transparent about? What do you want to give to the organization? And the timing of that is really important. And then it went all the way down to skip levels, right? Let's make sure, I wanted to make sure I was touching those 70 people one-on-one, at least, you know, once every 2 months, each person. So then you structure that in. And so that communication strategy, it needs to be mapped out and thoughtful. You can't just wing it. And then for each mechanism, to your point, well, what is the content? What do you want people to walk away with? And then you build the content back from there. And it can be very powerful based on the messages, the content, the information, and the tone of those conversations. And again, weaving that vulnerability in, and not just giving good news and spoon feeding that, you know, back to the BS meter is really important for folks.
Yeah. Thank you. Thank you. Anyone else want to add to that?
Yeah. I've been in a couple of situations where I've had to deliver bad news of something, of a mistake that I made, and or just, you know, a big expectation that was created, and I wanted to take ownership on it. I'm big on ownership. And what I've done is I learned now, less words are better. Just be clear and just say exactly what happened. As an example, I was, you know, preparing a company benefits. We were going to implement company benefits in one place, and we created a big expectation with people, and we had to postpone it for a few months, given some complexities, etc. I was very open by saying I just didn't plan properly. I thought I knew it all, and I didn't. But this is what we're doing. And the average person was okay. Instead of me saying, oh, all of these complexities in the marketplace and you don't understand because you're not doing what seriously, they don't care, because they're also facing uncertainties and complexities on their side. So you just have to be clear, vulnerable, real. But the other side is our playbooks are very based on our own styles, but we also have to be mindful that there's other individuals that are less extrovert, that they are more on their own way of doing things. So you have to kind of meet people where they are on that, and hopefully be a good inspiration source so that they can at least start gravitating to at least somewhere down the middle. Because I've also tried and failed a few times trying to push people to be overly transparent, and it's just, you know, it doesn't compute. They're like, so you have to balance out, you know, how to do it. But I will never ask anybody to do anything if I haven't done it better. That's kind of my biggest mantra. You know, enroll very quickly to the benefits or respond to a survey. I always tell people, I did it. It took me exactly this amount of time. Go and do it. Always. That's kind of one of my key communication tips. You know what I mean?
Yeah. It's interesting. Two things popped up. One of the fastest ways to lose trust with an organization is to underestimate the seat time. So I can remember some harassment training that I was putting together, and the CHRO, I was talking to her about it. And I said, well, I think the seat time is going to be, and she said, well, I don't know if people are going to do it. I said, well, if we're not honest with people, right? And just maybe we need to communicate early to let people know this is coming. Carve it out on your calendar. This is coming. But if we're not honest about those seat times, ooh, we can lose people like that. So, so important in what you said about just being able to communicate that and making sure that people understand that. I have one last question, but I want to just open it up to see if there's anything I may have missed or anything you want to share with the group around trust or any of those strategies.
I'll jump in just to add. So to go with the last comment around sharing more information is still a muscle that I'm actively working on, because for me, this is probably year 22 of me being in HR. So I came from when we told you what we needed you to know when we needed you to know it. If I didn't tell you, that means I didn't need you to know it. And I've recently had a leader that has said, no, we need to overshare. We need to over communicate so that there isn't any gray areas for people to assume or be confused on. So let's communicate more. And then I would say, because I started doing that, I've earned a lot more of the organization's trust. They trust in my expertise. They trust that I'm going to do what I say I'm going to do because I've over communicated throughout the entire time.
That's a mic drop. So I came into the HR department from sales. So I supported the sales team on a learning and development piece. And I said this, hope those folks aren't listening, but I said to them, I said, you all are like a sorority of librarians. And they said, what? And I said, because you all are the keeper. It was all female. Sorry. But I said, you all are like the keeper of all the information, like the librarian. And I'm old enough to remember the Dewey Decimal System. So, like, if you didn't know the Dewey Decimal System, it was like, go learn the Dewey Decimal System, and then you can get all the books in here. And I said, people need to know because your frontline leaders are HR. Because when they don't do the thing right and the people overstep them and come to you, now you have to fix things. So I think it's so important, as you said, because the world has shifted. So if the world has shifted, why in the world will we not shift the way, in some regards, keeping, of course, the things that, are fundamental, but shift the way we think about how we show up. The other thing that's really interesting is, there's certain professions from a trust perspective, right? If you have an extroverted, I don't know, physician, it's okay, right? You don't feel like the doctor's going to tell the next person your information, right? If you have an extroverted salesperson, you don't feel like they're going to give away all the sales strategies to their competitors. It's just their personality. But it's something about being an introvert or being an extrovert in HR and from a trust perspective. So I don't know. Anyone want to share their thoughts about that? This was not one of our questions, but I think as we transition in who we are, how can we become more extroverted so that we can build more trust with individuals?
I mean, I can quickly jump in. You may think I'm an extrovert, but it took me 25 years to become an extrovert, through time. I was extremely an introvert. And being on the HR side, I pushed myself to be an extrovert. So I totally understand both sides. One of the biggest mistakes that I have committed through my career that I'm learning from is trying to become the friend of everybody. Because I want them to love me. I want them to understand me. I want them to know that I'm doing the right thing for them. And then, sometimes people react very differently to my, they become overwhelmed. And I'm like, why are you overwhelmed? I'm taking care of you. So I think that balance between that extroversion, particularly on a one-on-one setting, or if you're not hyper aware of the other individual or individual style or the culture, can also backtrack and backfire on you. So it's just interesting on both sides. I don't think there's a perfect formula of being an introvert or an extrovert in HR, the same as there's not a perfect formula of swinging towards the H or the R. I think there's always room and space for all of us because we need it so that we can be a very inclusive and well thought of function,
Yeah, love that. Thank you. Anything else before we wrap up related to that or anything else?
Look, I'm a raging extrovert, which probably surprises no one who's been watching this panel. But I think actually your question, your really great question, comes back to trust, right? Sometimes it's just about trusting that if I put myself out there a little bit more, I'm gonna be okay, right? I'm not gonna get hurt, or at least I'm not gonna get hurt in a way that I can't recover from. And I'm just gonna put in a pitch, Paco, for something you said very early in this panel, which is therapy. I don't know that I would have survived 17 years in this field without therapy, without having a regular relationship with a therapeutic professional that I can, that gives me a space, that holds space for me to talk about these things, that helps guide me in my growth in this area. And if you're really lucky, your company, employer provided health plan might cover that therapy for you, right? So gosh, I mean, I make this recommendation to HR and DEI practitioners all the time. If that's not a part of your self-care practice, it's really worth considering.
Thank you. Thank you. You got to trust yourself before a trust can go between others. Yeah, so important. Well, I want to make sure we have an opportunity to hear from each person. I think we've got close to 7, 8 minutes before we close out. So maybe in a minute and a half or so, what do you want to leave the folks with as it relates to this topic and maybe everything that we've heard? So if I could put air quotes on you, or if I could say mic drop after you say this, what would you say? And we'll start off with Kelly.
Yeah, my quick, I wrote this down before the panel, is to have a very clear point of view on what type of HR leader you are and what you stand for. Because I think a lot of times when trust is not there, you have these HR leaders that get imprinted on and they kind of turn into the folks that they're working with. And that could change day by day. And all of a sudden you're kind of not consistent and you are different. And so do a lot of internal thinking, even writing on clarity of your own identity in this role, which allowed me to have kind of nice cemented feet to anything that kind of came my way over the years. And though there will be a lot.
Yeah, thank you. What about you, Paco?
I would say just be very curious of the environment you're walking to. I think we all have our own theories, we all have our own practices and our own biases on how we should communicate, what is right, what is wrong. But we will continuously be surprised on how leaders and employees perceive those things. So, in order to actually build even more trust, instead of just going in with a very strong stance that is unmovable on certain things, I love the concept of strong assumptions loosely held. You can always learn from somebody else. You can have a strong point of view, but you can always be curious. So just be curious, always defend your point of view, but always be open for others so you can continue to earn that trust in different ways.
Thank you. I had to write that down. That's what I'm going to use. Strong assumptions loosely held. Thank you. Takara, what about you before we close out?
Yeah, thank you for picking me before Allison. I know it's going to be amazing, man. So I would say to emphasize the importance of transparency, empathy, and support while still fostering trust and open communication. So that's the tagline. But I would say for any person in HR, learning, like Kelly said, how you operate. It's been super important for me in any organization that I've worked for that they allow me to show up as Takara. I can't be a watered down version of Angela. I can't be a watered down version of Allison or Kelly or even Francisco, right? That's not who I am. So it's important that I also work for an organization that sees me for me and allows me to show up with that so that I can do the rest of the things that are in the tagline.
Love that. We could end it there, but we're not. How about you, Allison?
I don't know. Maybe we should.
That was good.
It was real good. I'm going to suffer from overly confident expectations. I've learned so much from this panel, and I'm grateful for having had the opportunity to learn from all of you. In the end, the strategy that has worked, that has been most effective for me in building trust, is seeing my clients, whether they're in the leaders in the business, employees themselves, seeing them as customers. I don't know, maybe it's the Amazon coming out in me, right? But the thing about customers, right, is if they don't trust you, they're going to go find somebody else, right? To deal with their problem, to meet their needs. So I start with listening. I make it a point to understand the objectives that business leaders are trying to accomplish, as well as they understand them. I work for a robotics company. That can be challenging sometimes. It requires putting in a lot of effort, but it's worth putting in. Because then once I've listened and learned and I know that, I can build mechanisms, interventions, solutions that are designed perfectly around those objectives. They slot smoothly into their business plan. and then they don't see me as a roadblock, or that's stopping them, or a speed bump that's slowing them down, right? They see me as an accelerator to that work that they need to accomplish. And then I get to be the first phone call when something goes wrong or something doesn't look right. They proactively will reach out to me, and we can work together to make it right. So yeah, I think of them as my customers, and I do everything that I can to prevent them from going somewhere else to get the services that they should get from me.
I love that. If we could do an internal commercial, I almost think about like an insurance company, like the Good Hands people, you call them first, like call me first before you do anything. Did you trust me enough to do that? I just want to say thank you to each of you. I always say when you're involved in something, no one should have more fun than you. So hopefully each of you can say that about this panel. It was really informative. It was great to connect with everyone. I'm reading the chat, so I'm hoping everyone in the chat enjoyed this and you can show some love to each of our panelists. So again, thank you, and you all have a wonderful week. All right, thanks. Bye-bye.
Thank you for leading this panel.